Dealing with the right characters, such as the brains, lungs, like they're the ones who call the shots for the 12 ships. Another one more or less 10 up the coast, down south, which is 5 ships. And you get these people together, they all bring their entourages, and they sort of go to where this year's party's going to be, and then all the other Vikings looking for parties or Japan for gold, and for the John Steinbeck version. The people from the Dust Bowl coming to try to make living, whatever it might be, those people show up, they follow the party. They like grateful fans who go place to place following the band. They were probably the motorhead fans. In 865, 866, the big party is going to be in Cumbria, and the group of people that shows up to watch and participate in that show require a name, which might be for some of the motorhead that they understand, called the Great Big Party. The origin of the party is literally legendary. It involves the traditional story of one of these Vikings whose name we have, but that's a rare thing. Believe it or not, this discussion before the voluntary release. This is the early and it's the next 100 years of the sources to comparatively explode. So even having names during this period to work with is a little problematic, but the most famous name, if you were to talk to people on the street, they don't mention the history at all and ask them to know the names of the Vikings. The name we would get most of all because of what popular culture has done to this figure is almost certainly Ragnar Lothbrok. And trying to get your mind around who that person was in real life history is one of the many pieces of the story from my brain. Some people will suggest he never existed at all. I think most of what I read would go to the directions and assuming it was in early history, he was one of these figures that were trying to enter this demigod, the person whose name shows up here in the historical chronicles, but most known because it's written about in sagas, in epic eddies, called poetry, which is what allows the Viking side of the story any interplay at all. Its problems are related. And so who is Ragnar Lothbrok? This is hard to figure. He's supposed to have been one of the leaders in the great attack on Paris in the middle 840s. Those guys were slaughtered by the Vikings in front of their compatriots on an island in the Snake River. He was one of those guys. This is a couple decades later, and the way this story starts, remember ancient people love these kinds of things, where a whole geopolitical conflict starts because somebody steals another guy's wife or something. But this supposedly starts because of something done to Ragnar Lothbrok, and because of the thing that was done to him. His sons come looking for payback, and in a society like Scandinavia, known for its conflicts during this era, that's not how it will be. But what they kick off, if it has any connection to truth at all, is one of the most important geopolitical events in the Viking Age, and one that's always taken to sort of kick off the new era. A good story, although a case can be made that this is sort of just things sliding into one another historically speaking. What happened in the last 5 years?
What are you doing?
Next 5 years, it just sort of slides to this destination. But regardless, when I was growing up, I read the history of the Vikings by Wayne Jones. And here's the way Jones described his era, Ragnar's involvement in it, and writes cool. We've already seen the nuisance raids of individual leaders develop into big, well-organized expeditions, which exploited local divisions and lived off the invaded country for lengthening periods of time. A new stage, he writes, that of conquest and residence, now followed. 865, cultural war, at a guess, 500 to 1,000 men, arrived in England to initiate a more sustained and coherent assault than had yet been attempted. Their leaders were Ivar, called the Phonies, come up and help them. Legend tells us that they came from Scandinavia and Ireland to avenge the death of their father Ragnar, about whom we know nothing very much after his withdrawal from the sand in 845. Heresy included refugees, supposed to be leaders of, with 7,000 pounds of silver and the seeds of plague in his army, saying that he was reputed to have come to England with 2 ships' crews and been defeated by King Ella of Northumberland, who had him thrown into a pit and stung to death by snakes. Before he died, he was heard to say prophetically, the piglings would be grunting if they knew the plight of the boar. And suddenly, here they were, spouting and tusking and eating. That's a great story. How much of it is true is completely open to question. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, of course, is much more dry. This is not a saga. This is not, the scalding poetry. This is just the facts, man. And in 865, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, here are the facts, quote, this year sat the heathen army in the Isle of Thanet, and made peace with the men of Kent, who promised money therewith. But under the security of peace and the promise of money, the army, in the night, stole up the country and overran all Kent eastward. The next year is also a continuation of what's going on. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says, 866, quote, by the way, when they're talking about Ethelred, they're talking about kings or these kingdoms that make up the British Isles during this period. This year, Ethelred, brother of Ethelbert, took to the West Saxon government, and the same year came a large heathen army into England, and fixed their winter quarters in Scandinavia, where they were soon forced, and the inhabitants made peace with them. And forced, that's a great term. What it means is that deals were struck. The Vikings have this quality of, people who show up in the neighborhood and say something like, this king can have an issue or something happened to it. He has forced them to have to, the neighbors and the governments is very hard. Religious, you don't hurt us, we won't hurt you. Atheists were Vikings. That was something else. They tell you. Returned to their allegiance, and they were now fighting will suggest everything from this is a giant rain for flooding. It just keeps going, right? Until it gets any natural pushback, it just keeps flowing forward. And others who suggest that this is an outright attempt at conquest, conceived as such, planned as such, and carried out as such. Now there's another theory that's been around for a couple of decades pretty strongly in the last 30 or 40 years, and that's the idea that maybe the violence has been overemphasized in this whole Viking thing, and that maybe they came over as sort of peaceful settlers or immigrants or whatnot. I think that's been discounted, at least to a certain degree, but I like the way Neil Price sort of fuses the traditional Vikings as these, conquest-oriented super raiders and people who are looking for more migration and a new life, and he calls it sort of an armed family migration. And I thought to myself, there's a lot of times in history when you could describe something as an armed family migration, and there definitely, at least in my mind, seem to be echoes of, the American mythology of the pioneer conquest of the West, with the covered wagon and all that, and substitute the Viking longship for the covered wagon. And like I said, you can almost do a little bit of mad living here, a little plug and play with those two societies. Price also has this absolutely fascinating, difficult to explain easily idea of this being kind of a social experiment, perhaps. These are theories, he acknowledges all this, but a social experiment in the same way that someone, traveling out west in the old American mythology might see it as kind of a social experiment to start a new country, or to whatever it might be. And his idea was that during this period, as we mentioned, where governmental systems are changing, and today we look at it and say that personal freedom was, being under threat because all of the people that were used to having a sort of a decentralized farmer base with everybody's weekends of vote and they all day get together was being threatened by consolidation. And Scandinavia was going to go all European and become a kingship, and while we're out of there, we're fleeing to the New World. And the New World is Anglo-Saxon England and most other places, and they will keep, just like the settlers in the old American West, they'll keep going farther west, won't they, as time goes on. It's also very possible that this starts one way and morphs into something else. You get a clash of armed forces here for a while, and then once things settle down, the Vikings who were in Anglo-Saxon England send for their relatives. The little land taken off here in the north. It's wonderful, it's beautiful, there's no glaciers anywhere to be seen. Come on over and bring some of your friends. Settle this area. This area initially is going to be Northumbria that the Vikings have just captured. And Northumbria is going to be sort of ground zero for Vikingdom in this. The British Isles for quite some time. It's a great sort of striking out spot to hit other places. And during this time period, for 4 main years, they have bring Northumbria, which the Vikings have just taken, south of that Mercia, to the east of that, East Anglia, where the Vikings had originally lived. They made some sort of deal that became coursed, and Wessex would be by King Alfred. In 868, which is the year after the initial taking of Northumbria, he tried to take the next kingdom over, Mercia. They do this by, as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles going to say, that they do over and over again, fixing their winter quarters, they call it. It's essentially the moving of the concert venue. This sort of great analogy that we have going, and everyone comes in, they fortify the camp sort of rather quickly, and then the crowd moves in, and there they are, right in the middle of your neighborhood in a fortified camp. The interesting thing about these camps is that they will give no trouble at all to any of the major powers during this era or any earlier ones. It's not that sophisticated, but in this time period, and in this geographical area, siege warfare is sort of, at a low point, and the Vikings decide to, put up some earthen mounds and some wood flashing on top of that. You might as well just negotiate with them in 868. The king of Mercia, who had asked for help from the king of Wessex, and who brought his armies, and both their armies sort of face off with the Vikings, but the Vikings will come out and play, so the Mercians pay them to lead. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle gives the devastating a sentence where it says, "Well,
We got
pages, Mercians made peace with the army. So the Vikings go back to their main base, which is now Northumbria. They put a puppet king on the throne, but they do whatever they want. The next year they sort of rest. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says in 869, this year the army went back to York and sat there a year. Anglo history book says this was the key time period for the second wave of this invasion to happen, right? When they returned to conquest in the country, coming to create the infrastructure, the women, children, the whole thing, right? Movable wells. And in 870, the Viking army sets out from York, crosses over Mercia, and attacks the place where they originally landed, East Anglia, where they were horsed. So maybe the deal lapsed by now, whatever they were paid, or maybe this is just a great whatever arrangement they had. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says that in AD 870, quote, this year the army rode over Mercia into East Anglia, and there fixed their winter quarters at Then. And in the winter, King Edmund fought with them, but the Danes gained the victory and slew the king, whereupon they overran all that land and destroyed all the monasteries to which they came. The names of the leaders who slew the king were Ingvar and Hug, and at the same time they came to Menevston, burning and breaking and slaying abbot and monks and all that they there found. They made such a havoc there that a monastery which was before full rich was now reduced to nothing. And so they killed another king here. The traditional story for this guy who be canonized and turned into a saint, I believe, is that he was tied up. The Viking demanded that he renounce his Christian faith. When he did, they shot up both arrows and cut his head off. As is usual for this era, the evidence is fragmentary on the details. But what's clear is the Vikings have killed yet another king in Britain and taken yet another territory, so now Northumbria and East Anglia. And now they set their sights on Wessex. Before they do, in 870, the great heathen army breaks up, or at least one chunk of it moves away. That's the chunk that goes northward, maybe under Ireland, sometimes attacks the Scottish nation, in Ireland, fighting against other Vikings. Wonderful part of the story. The Irish, as I may have said, I don't know, they have names for the different Vikings that they run into, because Ireland is originally one of these places that's heavy-duty Norwegian Viking territory, and there's a lot of crossover. These raiding parties often involve people who are just interested in fighting. They come from all over the place, but basically Norwegians in Ireland, and then Danes show up. The Vikings are known to the Irish as the light-haired pagans, or the dark-haired pagans, and the light-haired pagans are the Norse, and the dark-haired pagans are the Danes. But they both involve themselves in Irish politics, will fight each other. I mean, the kings of Dublin are Norwegian brothers, I believe. This part of the Great Heathen Army will head on over to Ireland and fight there. The remaining part will be reinforced. There's going to be another group that shows up called the Great Summer Army, and these people head on over into Wessex to take on what will turn out to be the most formidable of all the kingdoms in Britain. And 871 is going to be a key year in the whole affair. It's known as the Year of 9 Engagements, and that gives you an idea of how many battles are fought. The Vikings established their camp in a place called Reading. And then they start facing off against the king of this region called Ethelred and his younger brother Alfred. Now, the sheer fact that they're mentioning the younger brother of the king as often as they're going to in this document should give us a clue that this document is not exactly an unbiased source. It will actually be compiled a couple of decades after this era, and the person who's going to be involved in its compiling is this Alfred guy. So you already get a sense of, we're shoving a very important person in this later story into this earlier
About 4 nights after this, King Ethelred and Alfred, his brother, led their main army to Reading, where they fought with the enemy. And there was much slaughter on either hand. Alderman Ethelwulf being among the slain, but the Danes kept possession of the field. And about 4 nights after this, King Ethelred and Alfred, his brother, fought with all the army on Ashdown, and the Danes were overcome.
End quote. It goes on to explain, the tactics of this battle, and apparently the Vikings got the high ground first and separated into 2 separate divisions, 2 separate shield walls, and so this was emulated on the other side. Ethelred commands one shield wall, Alfred the other. As I was reading this story, it's a sort of Alfred's a very important figure in British history, arguably the most important. You can make a case this is the father of England. And his story is in so many places positively Churchillian. The version of Churchill led on the beaches of the landings, with the Vikings playing the parts of the Germans. And all of a sudden remembered that Churchill actually wrote about this era. He published something called A History of English-Speaking Peoples, and he covered Alfred the Great in it. So I thought, well, I wonder if Winston Churchill's portrayal of Alfred the Great in history is Churchillian. Turns out it is. This is Winston Churchill talking about Alfred the Great. It sounds like he could be talking about himself. Right.
The results of this victory did not break the power of the Danish army. In a fortnight, they were again in defeat. But the Battle of Ashdown justly takes its place among historic encounters because of the greatness of the issue. If the West Saxons had been beaten, all England would have sunk into heathen anarchy. Since they were victorious, the hope still burned for a civilized Christian existence in this island. This was the first time the invaders had been back in the field. The last of the Saxon kingdoms had withstood the assault upon it. Alfred had made the Saxons feel confidence in themselves again. They could hold their own in an open fight. The story of this conflict at Ashdown was for generations a treasured memory of the Saxon writers. It was Alfred's first battle. Yet, it will hardly be his last. His classic 1950s work, The Age of Bacon Story, gives his life the group rundown. He says, quote, Alfred mounted the throne of West Saxony at the age of 22. Asser, chronicler, describes him as then illiteratus, which could mean either illiterate or Latinless. He was apparently epileptic and suffered a seizure at his wedding feast, but he is pictured as a vigorous hunter, handsome and graceful, and surpassing his brothers in wisdom and martial skill. A month after his accession, he led his little army against the Danes at Wilton, and was so badly defeated that to save his throne he had to buy peace from the foe. But in 878, he won a decisive victory at Effington. And it says, half the Danish host crossed the Channel to raid weakened France. The rest, by the Peace of Wetmore, agreed to confine themselves to northeastern England, in what came to be called the Danes.
End quote. I admire Durant's brevity there, but the truth of the matter is, the rest of Alfred the Great's life is going to be trying to deal with this arch nemesis of his, these Viking peoples, either defending his territory from them, or trying to reconquer the lands that they took from the English. Some of the Vikings at this time settled down. This was just talking about the Viking rulers in these territories parceling up the land and handing them out to members of these Viking groups that are like Oklahoma Sooners. The ones that will settle down, get a farm, start a family, do so. The ones who want to live in the Scandinavian version of the Loka, just sort of cross the channel and were softer targets. And as fate would have it, just as Anglo-Saxon England's getting tougher, the places that drove them there in the first place, when Charles the Bald played Superman and let those bullets bounce off his chest in Alfred's kingdom, now ricocheting off the mountain right back to where they originally came from. There are some primary source entries in most of the history
Stop. Come here.
The great heathen army can be tracked as it goes back over the English Channel to the continent and raises hell over there. I've got some other histories that suggest that after the Alfred the Great Treaty, you shouldn't call whatever's left the great heathen army anymore. Because, of course, as we said, those Viking hosts have an organic sort of flash mob kind of feel to them. And pick up members and lose members all the time, make alliances with other groups of Vikings that are squatting, in territories that they move to. These groups are a bit hard to keep track of what they're doing. But when these Vikings make peace in Anglo-Saxon England, and this is the pattern, the violence just crops up elsewhere. Whether it's the same band doing this or it just so happens, I don't know. Maybe it's all the roving people looking for the next, where's the next oil strike, right? Where's the next gold rush? But in the early age, you see back in Frisia again. And Frisia's always getting hit, right? Because it's the modern day Netherlands, as we said. It's right by Denmark, so you're right there. But this time, in the early 80s, the raids went down into Germany. Way down into Germany. Places like Cologne and Trier get hit. Famously, ironically, and symbolically, the Vikings will stable their horses in the royal palace in Aachen, where Charlemagne used to rule. All this was recorded by Adam Bremen a couple hundred years later. He had access to a Danish king, and supposedly, this is what the Dane history said for a couple hundred years previously. But the description follows a similar sort of an account that you would have heard in many of the places struck by the Vikings. And Adam Bremen writes, quote, "Then was Saxony laid waste by the Danes and Northmen. Duke Bruno was killed with 12 other counts, and Bishops Diethard and Markard were slain. At that time, Frisia was depopulated, and the city of Utrecht razed. St. Radbod, bishop of the town, retired before the persecution, fixed his see at Deventer, and taking his stand there, took vengeance on the pagans with the sword of anathema. Then the pirates set fire to Cologne and Trier. They stabled their horses in a palace at Aachen. The people of Bath began to erect fortifications for fear of the barbarians. Why say more? Cities with their inhabitants, bishops with their whole flocks were struck down at one time. Stately churches were burned for faith." Now, this is an interesting period in Carolingian history at this same time, because this is the end of Carolingian history. You get the last guy who tries to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. His name is Charles the Fat. And Charles the Fat gets an army together, goes up to this area, confronts the Vikings in Germany, and gives them like 2,500 pounds of silver to stop holding some land to settle on, and they're going to convert to Christianity. If you happen to meet a person from Cologne, for example, Trier, or any one of these places who's just had your farm destroyed, all your stuff stolen, family members killed, others taken into slavery, and the emperor shows up with an army that can really deal with these people, and I don't care what size Viking army you have, they do not want to deal with anybody's royal army if they can avoid it. I'm thinking this is the chance to show what you can do best, right? With my people, it's payback time, and Charles the Fat essentially looking like he knuckles under here, obviously he's not going to play well. Now there is a sort of a back channel that there's always been historical argument each other. That's something we don't know about it, but maybe this is intelligent behavior if you understood his position at the time in a way that our sources don't allow us to understand it now. I don't know, but he's got a bad rap. At least some people have said that. He is one of the most maligned figures in all Viking history, because by paying off these Vikings like that, it just displays weakness, as the evidence has already shown. As it just showed in Anglo-Saxon England, if you calm things down in one area, they're just going to go somewhere else. And it turns out that somewhere else is in Charles the Fat's empire also. So all he's done is remove a problem from one area and send it to Paris this time. And Paris Paris is part of his realm too. And Paris, as we had said, had already been hit multiple times in 845, middle 840s, maybe by Ragnar Lothbrok. The 860s it gets hit a couple of times, but the so-called siege of Paris from 885 to 886 is one of the more famous Viking incidents ever. It is also one where we have an eyewitness account, but it's a really difficult eyewitness account to use. It's from a guy, a monk actually, called Abbo, and he writes a piece that the translator version that I have calls a piece of magical realism, where the ordinary, he says, becomes fully charged with the otherworldly, but that's not abnormal for the literature of the time period. And this is a poem, actually, but it's a poem by a guy who watched the siege of Paris. It's the first eyewitness account we have, but it's not all that trustworthy. I mean, when the battle goes bad, and the reason it turns around is because a couple of saints intervene, well, take it with a grain of salt, right? A piece of magical realism. But the only piece of magical realism by an eyewitness, so for example, when Abbo describes a Viking climbing up a ladder, getting a mixture of tar, wax, and oil that has been boiled, poured on his head, and his head explodes, one can say that that's the sort of thing that eyewitness would know, that maybe would tease out of the rest of the story that might be really believable. But if you want to see the dilemma facing the Vikings here, just go look at the satellite photo right now of the island in the middle of the same part of Paris that the really old everything else. And it's an island right in the river. Ancient place, recognized as important. Clovis, the first king of the Franks, had his throne there, I believe. I mean, it's sort of a seat of power area, the main sort of center of Paris, even back during this time period. And for 20 years, ever since Charles the Bald had said, we're going to start a ready reaction force, we're going to stop selling best weapons to the pagans, and we're going to create fortified bridges, they've been working on fortified bridges, right? There's one almost done here, and there's another one made is done, and those two connect this island in the same to the two banks. And the Vikings won through there. Now, Abbo is called by some a surreal exaggerator. Delbrook is merciless in saying his convoluted hexameters are not to be believed in any way, shape, or form. But as I said, sometimes you can pull out the little nuggets, like what happens to someone's head when you pour boiling oil on it. He says 700 ships show up in the river, which is a huge exaggeration, no matter how you slice it. But these Vikings were making deals with local Viking groups on the scene, and they often did these sort of joint expedition arrangements. And there may have been 8,000 to 10,000 Vikings, which, that's a ton of Vikings. Supposedly, they just want passage, right, to raid downriver. And according to Abbo, who may have been in the room, what can we trust, what can't we trust? He's got his own reasons for writing this. He says that the Viking warlord, who he says is not a king, but does command a lot of warriors, shows up and asks for the deed.
Aren't you just the cutest?
My translation of the Viking attacks on Paris is by Dr. Nermal Das, and in it, the bishop spelled differently. I'm just going to give this traditional name, which is Jocelyn. The other person in the story is Count Odo, who's important to it. In the poem, Abbo says in this conversation, the Viking leader shows up and basically says, don't be a fool, just let us go by. We don't want any trouble with you. I should also point out that Abbo doesn't describe these Vikings as sort of any sort of stereotypical barbarians, loutish, drunk brutes, uproarious. I mean, he called them grim several times, like the translation, grim men. He writes, quote, and when in 2 days these ships made landfall hard by the city, Siegfried did make his way to the great hall of the famed shepherd. Though king in name only, he still commanded many warriors. After bowing his head, he addressed the bishop in these words, Jocelyn, show mercy to yourself and the plot given you, that you may not come to ruin. Raise our people, we ask you. Give us your consent that we might go our way, well beyond the city. Nothing in it shall we touch, but shall preserve and safeguard all the honors that belong to you and Odo, meaning Count Odo, who is the noblest of all counts, and who is the future king. That should tell you right there that maybe you shouldn't trust this totally, because, how does Siegfried know that Count Odo is the future king? Nonetheless, it gives you a sense of the feeling of how the feeling is. The response from Bishop Jocelyn and Count Odo is part of the French tradition that's similar in vibe to the Alfred tradition. Heroes that stand up to the Vikings when the ancient authorities like Charles II. This is the French version of the time period, and it's interesting. They're contemporaries of Alfred, right? And Abbo writes the response the bishop and Odo have to this Viking, this grim man's demand is quote. Then the Lord's bishop, in greatest loyalty, offered these words. By our king, Charles, have we been given this city to guard. By him, whose majestic ground spreads almost over the whole earth, by the Lord's will, who is king and master of the mighty, the realm must not suffer by the destruction of this city.
Come here, sweetheart.
Rather, this city must save the realm and preserve the peace. Well, if by chance these walls were entrusted to you, as they are to us, and you were asked to do all that you have asked of us, would you deem it right and agree? And Siegfried answers, by my honor, rather my head were lopped off by a sword and thrown to the dogs. However, if you do not agree to my requests, we shall have our siege engines at daybreak hurl poisoned darts at you. With sunset, you shall know hunger's curse. It shall go on for years. Thus having spoken, he went his way and assembled his men. End quote. Historians have no idea how many people this warlord commands. The translator for mine, Abbo, says that the number Abbo gives is 40,000 Vikings versus 200 defenders should be discounted. It's a religiously symbolic number, not to be taken literally. But once again, that leaves us with no numbers. My encyclopedia of military history says this is the high water mark of Viking attacks on the continent against the former current Frankish Empire. I don't know if that's exactly true, but it's pretty safe to say this is one of the largest groupings of Vikings that the world has ever seen. And 8,000 to 10,000 seems very possible, and that's a lot of Vikings. They have a camp nearby. We are told by Albo that they are raping, pillaging, taking slaves, killing everybody in the vicinity. Makes them sound over and over again like Tolkien's voice. There's a lot of Tolkien in this, actually. In the defense of the Vikings, though, this is standard operating procedure in the pre-war. Much more normal to have this happen in a siege situation than not. Go back to your ancient days, right? Or the traditional hoplite deal, unwritten agreement, is that if you hide behind your walls and say, come and get us, we can scour your territory, right? Until you decide to come out and fight for it. The other thing in defense of the Vikings here is that this is an army that has to feed itself. Where are they going to get the food from? These aren't Roman troops or Chinese troops or troops that are going to have long supply chains that continually feed them, continually bring a full supply depots. These people live off the land, as Napoleon and his revolutionary troops. What that does to the land. But these people in Paris are kind of shut up, especially the one central island, which we should imagine having an entire sort of early medieval stone wall around it. Those two bridges that we talked about, the Vikings are going to fight essentially a battle against fortifications. And fortifications are, as we all know, of course, multiplied. So they're outnumbered defenders by quite a bit. It's not as big of a deal as if we were talking about a field battle here. And in October, November 885, the Vikings assault these defenses, and you can sense of the rhythm. The rhythm is that there are several big pushes for the next 11 months. And in between those pushes, it settles down to sort of a typical blockade situation. lot of innovation that happens, and a lot of it involves fire. At one point, the Vikings will take, I think the sources say 3 big ships loaded with incendiary material, light them on fire, guide them down the river with ropes, both banks, and try to steer it into the bridge and at least burn up all the defenders. There may be a clue into the building practices of the early Middle Ages when we find out that they've been working on the defenses here for 20 plus years and they're still not totally completed. They build them really well, but maybe it takes a long time. The stone tower on the stone bridge is not quite done yet. It becomes a focal point in the early battle. But you will read how it says, you'll read about them essentially dropping things on the Vikings all the time as the Vikings have ladders or on ships below the bridge and they're trying to make their way up at one like a giant wheel. It makes it sound like it's massive, is thrown over the side. Pablo says it crushes 6 Vikings or then dragged back to the boats where they're apparently keeping the corpses. The mixture of pitch wax and oil that is boiled and thrown over the side. We talked about it earlier. To me, the most interesting part of that, part of Pablo's poem, is that the soldiers on both sides talk to each other during the fighting. And I forget that this happens, but in an era where people were close enough to do that, I guess it's only natural. What was trying to kill? Or that was trying to kill you? And Abbo has another interesting, I had to read the translation several times, and I hope I got it right. But I had thought it was one person gelling stuff from the Christian side to the Viking side, but Abbo makes it pretty clear that this is like a group chant, which begs the question, how do these people know what to say? Because they must have said it multiple times. And the way he writes makes it sound almost like a sports chant, like a soccer chant. And like every time that they throw the cauldron of boiling, pitch or whatever over the side, scorch a Viking, they all yell the same thing. Here's a taste of the battle as Abbo describes it, talking about the Viking assault on that unfinished tower, and they made a lot of progress one day, and then they go to sleep, come back the next day to continue with their left off, only to find that the people of Paris have come out with their hammers and chisels and nails and everything, and with wood instead of stone, rebuilt a lot of what the Vikings destroyed the day before. So here's how the story goes from Abbo, quote, "Now the tower did not shine forth with all its magnificence, for it was far from finished, but its foundations were solid, and stood firmly grounded. Proudly it rose, its crenels were sound. During the night that followed after the battle had ended, a wooden tier was built all the way around the tower, raised atop the old bastion, and half as high as before. Thus, together, the sun and the Danes beheld this new tower. The latter were soon locked in a frightful fight with the faithful, meaning the Christians. Arrows flew here and there through the air. Blood gushed and flowed. Darts, stones, and javelins were hurled by ballistas and slingshots. Nothing was seen between heaven and earth but these projectiles. The many arrows made the tower, built in the night, grown out. It was the night that gave it birth, as I have chanted above. Fear seized the city. People screamed. Battle horns resounded, calling everyone to come and protect the trembling tower. Christians fought and ran about, trying to resist the assault." End quote. He then talks about how amazing victorious Odo, as he calls the count, was. Again, this is Batman stepping in with the central authority is either too corrupt, too ignorant, or too hapless to step in and do their job, and he comes in and he's everywhere to be seen. Once Bishop Jocelyn dies, apparently in the siege, it's Odo all the time. He's, as we said, proven like Alfred the Great in England at this moment. Abbo says of him, quote, "He fortified those who were exhausted, revived their strength, and rushed on about the tower, striking down the enemy. As for those who sought to dig beneath the walls with iron picks, he served them up with oil and wax and pitch, which was all mixed up together and made into a hot liquid on a furnace, which burned the hair of the Danes, made their skulls split open. Indeed, many of them died, and others went and sought out the river. And then our men, with one voice, my emphasis, with one voice, loudly exclaimed, 'Right badly scorched are you.'" And to make matters worse, if you were a blistering, dying Viking, you retire towards your ships in the hope you can get a little medical attention or whatnot. Turns out, Abbo says, their wives are there. But instead of being in a mood to, moisten their brow, them, they're heckling them, basically saying, what the heck is this? Why are you coming back here? Get back in the fight, you wimp, that kind of thing. You'd be inclined to discount this as some sort of exaggeration or weird invention of ours, except it actually fits as a data point to the long-running amount of historical evidence we have for at least pagan Germanic women doing this, and maybe even a broader section of Europeans going back to Celtic times doing this, with the wives and the women of the group are there at the battle. In fact, the Icelandic sagas of the Viking era, the later in this period, actually say the same thing. So this is another data point that suggests that the wives are there. And in the old Germanic tales by the Romans, there were wagons that were behind the battlefield, and the wives were there. Here it's the ships that play the same role. And the women have several different approaches they can use. This is the one you see all the time, the heckling, but they also have the ones, the Roman thing, they would bare their breasts and tell their loved ones what would happen to them if they lost this battle and the other side conquered them, right? Think about what happened to your family that's here. Would you fight harder if your family was at the battlefield you were fighting on? And finally, the last thing that sometimes the women in these situations do is actually do what you would hope if you were a Viking that they would do. Moisten your brow, give you something cool to drink, and maybe give you some food and nurse your injuries. But not this time. Abo says that they're heckling, so goaded the men back into the cauldron and fight. There is a ton of almost like commando activity, maybe is the best way to describe it, that happens between the big attacks. People will scale the walls in one spot, a couple dozen, and then a couple dozen of the defenders have to take them on. So there's a bunch of force 10 of Avalon stuff in this Abo, including the way that they eventually solve the problem, because the Fat Man counter character is going to slip out of the blockade, get all the way back to the command palace of the Emperor himself, Charles the Fatter, the one of the kinder Charles the Stout. Says, please come and help Paris. He's inclined not to, the sources say, but has some advisors say, we will really bad. You just let the Vikings do this. So he goes through the laborious, slow process of putting a royal army together, the laborious, slow process of having it make its way up to where the battle is happening. Then they establish a camp there, and they start killing every Viking that they find outside the Viking camp. And now you have a bit of a face-off. Right? Royal camp with all of that. Viking enclosure nearby, and then, of course, Paris under siege, and bodies rotting in the sun, which is going to get disease. You're not going to want to have to sit there very long waiting for something to happen when people are dying. As I said, Bishop Jocelyn supposedly dies from disease. So the Vikings make a deal with Charles the Fat. And exactly the same sort of deal it sounds like that they asked for before this entire 11-month siege even started. In other words, the Vikings got the same deal that they asked for originally, and the Emperor gives it to them. Can you imagine how the people of Paris, having endured 11 months of this field, when the royal army finally shows up and you have a chance to chastise the people who inflicted this pain and suffering on you, and instead he gives them a bunch of silver and lets them continue down past the now broken and destroyed bridges of Paris, down the Seine to raid havoc deeper into the interior of France, right? The thing that Bishop Jocelyn Abo says, it said, we have a responsibility, we have to protect France. And the deal the Emperor says is not to be rich silver. Raid these people in Burgundy, where it was going against me anyway. This will contribute to the fall, eventually, of Charles the Fat, whose empire is going to splinter into multiple kingdoms. And the guy who gets to be the king of this part of the former Carolingian Empire is going to be Count Odo, who's going to start his own royal line in French history, which is one of the more, again, one can make a case that this is like the founding foundations of France. Charlemagne would be another possible candidates for that title. By the time Count Odo becomes King Odo in France in the late 880s, the spike in the piracy stock market we call the Viking Age had been going on for 100 years. And the economic costs are unquantifiable. We want to get a little teeny window into what the cost might look like. Historian Dan Jones, in his book Powers and Thrones, quotes another historian who estimates that 14% of all the silver pennies minted by the entire Frankish Empire over the entire century of the 800s went to pay off the Vikings just for protection money, just for go-away funds, right? Doesn't include any of the money the Vikings directly stole or looted in their many attacks. Doesn't include any of the money that the Empire had to spend to defend themselves or fight the Vikings. Doesn't include any of the lost productivity or emotional costs of all the people the Vikings killed or stole and sold into slavery. 14% of all the silver pennies in direct payments for protection. Sometimes when you see estimates of organized crime drains away from a society's economy, it kind of looks similar, doesn't it? In some societies anyway. Nonetheless, you would think that with the 900s approaching, that finally, after 100 years of steel sharpening steel, weeding out the incompetence and bringing the effective people to the fore, that things would look good for the traditional opponents of the Vikings here in King Odo in France and Alfred in Anglo-Saxon England, but by about 900, 901, 902, both guys are dead. And in fact, you know, the Batman that was King Odo will live to eventually see the hero become the villain when he will disappoint his fanboy Avo and pay off the Vikings himself at one point. Pulling the Charles the Fat, if you will. It just shows how unavoidable it was sometimes. But if you're looking at this in 900, you can't help but notice that these Viking groups that had been disjointed, fragmentary groups of people under warlords or chieftains are starting more and more to unite into more viable, larger economic and political entities. They're in the process of state building. They're getting stronger all the time. It's almost like you can hear the ominous Darth Vader music in the distance approaching. Alfred dead, Odo dead, the Vikings consolidating. The 900s looks particularly scary if you are a Viking opponent. The weird part about this era, though, is you can also apply sort of a Russian element. Saying that if you're a Viking, you may be hearing ominous Darth Vader music coming into the 900s as well. We quoted a couple of recent historians who point out that the Vikings in this period were well aware that their culture and belief system and way of life was under siege. They are, by 900, an endangered species, the cultural equivalent of a white rhino, a representation of a style of Germanic language paganism on its way out, in the last convulsions of its dying days, soon to see its values supplanted and its gods abandoned. But even if you have mortally wounded a white rhino, doesn't mean you still can't be gored. So far as we've been discussing elves and trolls and sorcery and female spirits inhabiting all Viking peoples, don't seem to have played a huge role in the story, but if that's the framework that your reality is constructed upon, it's hard to tease out exactly what kind of important role it plays in the worldview of a people who in some cases are fighting to preserve a worldview. The 900s, the period we're entering in now, is in books like Gwen Jones's Viking history book, what I grew up with. This is the period where he really starts the conversation, and everything we've already talked about is almost like prehistory. I should tell you something. In part 2, we'll get into a little bit of material, troubling, difficult, and strange as it is. It gives the Viking soul at least a little bit of chance to sing. That and some ruins and a long ship or two, and you can get very far in the world. And in part 2, we'll see exactly how far the Vikings get before that wave breaks and is rolled over by the exact same opponent that rolled over all of the these people's precursors. The end of a process that's been going on since the Roman Republic. All that and more in part 2 of Twilight of the Iceberg. I've always said I would want a public image because I didn't like or use whatever it is that I'm talking about, and I seem to like or use few things these days. But I do use this, or at least I used the first version of this, I used the second version of this, and in February 2023, the third version of this is coming out, and I will instantly snap that sight unseen. And I haven't seen it. I've got a list of features that are going to be involved with it, but that's not me. I know what I'm getting here. I almost feel like this ad should just be me saying, hey, Company of Heroes 3 is coming out in February 2023. Some products sell themselves to me. This is one of those games that, at least from my standpoint, I can't stop playing. Company of Heroes 2 has been around for quite a while, and I'm still playing it. And they have all these mods that people create, so there's this endless sort of growth tree that comes off of at least, 1 and 2, where it just seems to never get old, never get stale. And once you have sort of your base foundation there, you can play it for years, and I'm going to be proof of that. I mean, I'm told that the graphics are better. I like the graphics on 2, but I like the graphics on 3. Legendary battles that they're including are going to be like Lamaine, landings at Montezino, struggling in the central Italy area. They have some things that I don't know what they do, but I'm excited about them. A turn-based dynamic campaign map. So that sounds strategic to me, and that'll be fun. Something that they call a full tactical pause feature in Lears. They have one thing under a heading here. I'm just going to read it verbatim. It says, lead both the Deutsches Afrika Corps in their assault across Libya and the Allied war effort to liberate the Italian peninsula in our biggest single-player offering to date. Excited about that? I'm easy too excited about this game. Like I said, I've played for years. And I played the precursors to this game, which are some of the greatest games that have ever been invented for PC platforms anywhere. So, like I said, I feel like I should just be saying, it's coming out February 23, get yours in February. There's a tease here for the graphics, I think, that says, battle from the sweeping deserts and oases of North Africa to the sleepy fishing villages and rolling mountains of Italy. Okay, I'm in. Company of Heroes 3 will be out in February 2023. Get yours and let me know what you think. And I should have mine by February, right? I'm not waiting till March.
So Rome always wins, because even if they lose battles, they go to the Italian allies and have citizens and raise new armies. So how do you beat them? He can never raise that many troops himself. And Hannibal, I think, correctly figures out the one way to maybe defeat Rome is to cut them away from their allies. Well, how do you do this? Hannibal's plan is, I'm not going to wait and fight the Romans, Spain, or North Africa. I'm going to invade Italy. So I'm going to strike at the heart of this growing Roman Empire. And my hope is that if I can win a couple big battles against Rome in Italy, the Italians will want their freedom back. And they'll rebel from Rome and maybe even join me. Because most people who've been conquered want their freedom back. So this is a reasonable plan. So Hannibal famously crosses the Alps with elephants, dramatic stuff. Nobody expects him to do this. Nobody thinks he can do this. He shows up in northern Italy. Romans send an army. Hannibal massacres. He is a military genius. Rome takes a year, raises a second army. We know this story. Sends it against Hannibal. Hannibal wipes him out. Rome gets clever this time. They say, okay, Hannibal's different. We're going to take 2 years, raise 2 armies, and send them both out at the same time against Hannibal. So they do this, and this is the Battle of Cannae, which is one of the most famous battles in history. Hannibal is facing this army of 80,000 Romans about, and he comes up with a strategy called double envelopment. We can go into it later if you want. It's this famous strategy where he basically kind of sucks the Romans in, surrounds them on all sides, and in one afternoon, at the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal kills about 60
Romans. Now, just to put that in perspective, that's more Romans hacked to death in one afternoon with swords than Americans died in 20 years in Vietnam.
The following is a conversation with Gregory Otrente, a historian specializing in ancient Rome and military history. This is the last reading of the podcast. To support it, please check out our sponsors in the description. Now, dear friends, here's Gregory Otrente. What do you think is the big difference between the ancient world and the modern world?
Well, the easy answer, the one you often get, is technology. And obviously there's huge differences in technology between the ancient world and today. But I think some of the more interesting stuff is a little bit more amorphous things, more structural things. So I would say, first of all, childhood mortality. In the ancient world, and this is true of Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, really anybody up until about the Industrial Revolution, about 30 to 40% of kids died before they hit puberty. So, I mean, put yourself in the place of an average inhabitant in the ancient world. If you were an ancient person, 3 or 4 of your kids probably would have died, would have buried your children. And nowadays we think of that as an unusual thing. And just psychologically, that's a huge thing. You would have seen multiple of your siblings die. If you were a woman, for example, if you were lucky enough to make it to, let's say, age 13, you probably would have to give birth 4 or 5 times in order just to keep the population from dying out. So those kind of grim mortality statistics, I think, are a huge difference psychologically between the ancient world and the modern.
Well, fundamentally, do you think human nature changed much? Do you think the same elements of what we see today, fear, greed, love, hope, optimism, and cynicism, you know, the underlying forces that result in war, all of that permeates human history?
Crude answer, yes. I think human nature is roughly constant. And for me, as an ancient historian, the kind of documents that I really like dealing with are not the traditional literary sources, but they're the things that give us those little glimpses into everyday life. So stuff like tombstones or graffiti, or just something that survives on a scrap of parchment that records a financial transaction. And whenever I read some of those, I'll have this moment of, feeling, oh, I know exactly how that person felt. Here across 2,000 years of time, completely different cultures, I have this spark of sympathy with someone from antiquity. And I think, as a historian, the way you begin to understand an alien, a foreign culture, which is what these cultures are, is to look for those little moments of sympathy. But on the other hand, there's ways in which ancient cultures are wildly different from us. So you also look for those moments where you just think, how the hell could these people have done that? I just don't understand how they could have thought or acted in this way. And it's lining up those moments of sympathy and kind of disconnection that I think is when you begin to start to understand a foreign culture or an ancient culture.
I love the idea of assembling the big picture from the details, the little pieces, because that is the thing that makes it life. The big picture is nothing without the details.
Yep, and those details would bring it to life. It's not the grand sweep of things. It's seeing those little hopes and fears. Another thing that I think is a huge difference between the modern world and the ancient is just that basically everybody's a farmer. Everybody's a small family farm, and we forget this. I was just writing a lecture for my next Great Courses course, and I was writing about farming in the ancient world. And I was really thinking, if we were to write a realistic textbook of, let's say, the Roman Empire, 9 out of 10 chapters should be details of what it was like to be a small-time family farmer, because that's what 90% of the people in the ancient world did. They weren't soldiers, they weren't priests, they weren't kings, they weren't authors, they weren't artists, they were small-town family farmers. And they lived in a little village, they never traveled 20 miles from that village, they were born there, they married somebody from there, they raised kids, they mucked around in the dirt for a couple decades, and they died. They never saw a battle, they never saw a work of art, they never saw a philosopher, they never took part in any of the things we define as being history. So that's what life should be, and that's represented.
Nevertheless, it is the emperors, and the philosophers, and the artists, and the warriors who carve history.
And it is the important stuff. So, I mean, that's true. There's a reason we focus on that.
That's a good reminder, though. If we want to truly empathize and understand what life was like, we have to represent it fully.
And I would say let's not forget them. So let's not forget what life was like for 80-90% of the people in the ancient world, the ones we don't talk about, because that's important too.
So the Roman Empire is widely considered to be the most powerful, influential, and impactful empire in human history. What are some reasons for that?
The moment we stop pursuing the truth is the very moment we open up the door for the destruction of society in ways we cannot even begin to imagine. My name is James Cadiz, and this is my story. I grew up in Southern California. My mom and my dad were both born and raised in Egypt. They immigrated from Egypt legally. My mother and father absolutely left their country so that they could have a better life for them and their children and for future generations. The childhood that my mom and my dad gave me was extraordinary. I have an older brother, a younger sister, and a younger brother. Arabic was the second language that we spoke in our home. It was the language that my mom and my dad spoke to one another. So as children, of course, we all spoke it. My dad's father was a pastor in Egypt for 65 years, and my mother's father was a Baptist minister for 35 years in Egypt. I did not make a serious commitment to Christ until I was 16 years old. I used going to church as a justification for me to drive my dad's car. It was a scam. I told my dad I was going to go to a different church, so I'd like to drive his car in order to do my dad let me. Of course, I want you to go to church. So I went to church. I went a few times, and then by the time I went to, I think the third or fourth time I went to church, I'm like, oh, I'm going to give this a try. I really want to give my life to the Lord. I used to get really mad at my mom because my mom would pray for me early in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, Lord save my sons. And I used to hear her, and it just bothered me. And my mom told me, she said, James, I know because God told me you're going to be a pastor one day. Well, that made me not want to be a pastor. Like, I hated the idea. I hate the thought. And then a few months into me walking with the Lord, I just felt like this real need in my heart to just share my faith with somebody. And so that made me realize, yeah, this is what I'm called to do. I became a pastor 31 years ago, and I love it. I love every minute of what I do. People have all of a sudden become subject matter experts in the Middle East. These college students crack me up. Actually, sometimes just sadden me. They don't know what river, they don't know what sea, they don't understand the language that my mom and my dad were born and raised speaking. They don't know the culture, they don't know the background, they have no idea the stories. It's just amazing. We want to be noble in how we represent what's going on over there when we really don't understand what's really happening. By the way, can I just make this one comment? I think it's really important to say this. Did you know that the first Palestinians that ever existed in Israel were actually Jews? Like, when you start talking about early Roman history, okay? Near the time when the Roman society started falling apart, the leader of the Roman Empire did not like the idea that there were Jews that were still in the area that we know as Israel. So he actually renamed that area Palestina. That was the Roman word that was named after the Israelis' ancient enemies of the Jews, who were what? The Philistines. So when they started calling people Palestinians, it was mockery to the Jews. So if you want to talk about Palestinians being in the land first, they were in the land first. They're right, they were Jews. My family back in Egypt, they were taught to love Israel and to love God's ancestrally chosen people and Jews. The reason why they were taught that is because you cannot be a Christian who believes in the Bible and not love the Jewish people, okay? Because it's a directive given to us in the Word of God. If you love everything about God, then you're going to love His people. Now, don't get me wrong. You can have all kinds of opposition in your heart towards political maneuverings that are going on in Israel right now. And you can even not agree with some of the things that you're seeing happening. But if you do not support Israel and you do not support Jews, you are fundamentally misappropriating what the Bible is telling you. The nation of Israel is a God-ordained function of the existence of the Jewish people. It was prophesied. The Bible told us that the nation of Israel would be reestablished. American Israel, they were inspired by God. That's where they have something in common. Where they don't have something in common is this. God made a promise to Israel. He told Israel, no matter what, the sun, the moon, the stars are around, you're going to be around. You're never going to go bye-bye. He didn't make that promise to America. the promise that we have in the United States of America is predicated upon our willingness to allow this republic to function the way our founding fathers chose to have it function, which was based on biblical principles. If the founding fathers can create principles based on the scriptures, and that worked for over 200 years, and us in the last 5 years decide to go in a completely different direction, and we're on the precipice of losing it, don't you think we should learn something from that? We are watching the values that we were raised with fall by the wayside. We're watching the world, as a result, begin to fall by the wayside. Truth is important because if you don't have truth, you don't have the foundation to function, right? Empirical data, as we know it today, is founded on truth. The moment we stop pursuing the truth is the very moment we open up the door for the destruction of society in ways we cannot even begin to imagine. Because if truth is no longer a standard that we can go by, we no longer have the ability to be able to understand or determine where something is founded versus where it's not founded. And you can always track the destruction of anything back to an abandonment of the truth. America is at a very pivotal moment. We're going to lose this battle if we don't start on the correct foundation. And the foundation is the pursuit of truth and allowing the foundation of truth to build everything that we're fighting for. Because if we don't have that foundation, we're dead. We're dead in the water. We lose. The republic is gone. America's worth fighting for. You darn straight it's worth fighting for. We need to support Israel, fight for America, and stand for truth. I want to personally thank you for watching this video, and it's really important that we keep these videos free by making a tax-deductible donation to PragerU. This is for the architects of tomorrow. The ones who create to make a lasting impact. Who are rewriting the world with tools that push what's possible. For those who build responsible AI that's secure from the start. So you can build your way and go further, faster. Because whatever you dream of creating, the world is yours to build. Microsoft, yours to build.
Yeah, I mean, Rome has been hugely influential, I think, just because of the image. I mean, there's all these practical ways. I mean, the words I'm using to speak with you today, 30% are derived from Latin, another 30% are from Latin-descended languages. Our law codes, I mean, our habits, our holidays, everything comes fairly directly from the ancient world. But the image of Rome, at least again in Western civilization, has really been the dominant image of a successful empire. And I think that's what gives it a lot of its fascination. This idea that, it was this great, powerful, culturally influential empire. And there's a lot of other empires. I mean, we could talk about ancient China, which arguably was just as big as Rome, just as culturally sophisticated, lasted about the same amount of time. But at least in Western civilization, Rome is the paradigm. But Rome is a little schizophrenic in that it's both the empire, when it was ruled by emperors, which is one kind of model, and it's the Roman Republic, when it was a pseudo-democracy, which is a different one. And it's interesting how some later civilizations tend to either focus on one or the other of those. So, the United States, revolutionary France, they were very obsessed with the Roman Republicanism model. But other people, Mussolini, Hitler, Napoleon, they were very obsessed with the empire, Victorian Britain, as a model. So Rome itself has different aspects. But what I think is actually another big difference between the modern world and the ancient is our relationship with the past. So one of the keys to understanding all of Roman history is to understand that this was a people who were obsessed with the past, and for whom the past had power, not just as something inspirational, but it actually dictated what you would do in your daily life. And today, especially in the United States, we don't have much of a relationship with the past. We see ourselves as free agents, just floating along, not tethered to what came before. And the classical story that I sometimes tell my classes to illustrate this is, Rome started out as a monarchy. They had kings. They were kind of unhappy with their kings. Around 500 BC, they held a revolution and they kicked out the kings. And one of the guys who played a key role in this was a man named Lucius Junius Brutus. Okay. 500 years later, 500 years down the road, the guy comes along, Julius Caesar, who starts to act like a king. So if you have trouble with kings in Roman society, who are you gonna call? Somebody named Brutus. Now, as it happens, there is a guy named Brutus in Roman society at this time who was one of Julius Caesar's best friends, Marcus Junius Brutus. Now, before I go further with the story, I think you might know where it ends. I used to talk about how important your ancestors are in Roman culture. I mean, if you went to an aristocratic Roman's house and opened the front door and walked in, the first thing you would see would be a big wood cabinet. And if you open that up, what you would see would be row after row of wax death masks. So when a Roman aristocrat died, they literally put hot plates on his face and made an impression of his face at that point. And they hung these in a big cabinet right inside the front door. So every time you entered your house, you were literally staring at the faces of your ancestors. And every child in that family would have obsessively memorized every accomplishment of every one of those ancestors. He would have known their career, what offices they held, what battles they fought in, what they did. When somebody new in the family died, there would be a big funeral, and they would talk about all the things their ancestors had did. The kids in the family would literally take out those masks, tie them onto their own faces, and wear them in the funeral procession. So you were like wearing the face of your ancestors. So you as an individual were important. You were just the latest iteration of that family. And there was enormous weight, huge weight, to live up to the deeds of your ancestors. So the Romans were absolutely obsessed with the past, especially with your own family. Every Roman kid who was, let's say, an aristocratic family can tell you every one of his ancestors back centuries. I can't go beyond my grandparents. I don't even know. But that's, maybe 100 years. So it's a completely different attitude towards the past.
And the level of celebration that we have now of the ancestors, even the ones we can name, is not as intense as it was in the Roman time.
It was obsessive and oppressive. It determined.
Oh,
Yes, because there's that weight for you to act like your ancestors did.
Do you think, not to speak sort of philosophically, but do you think it was limiting to the way the society develops to be deeply constrained by the limiting in a good way or a bad way, do you think?
It's hard to reach your goals when your teams are pulled in too many directions. With the Sonnet, tasks and company-wide goals are in one place, so everyone's aligned. Try a Sonnet, a smarter way to work.
Financial. That feeling you get when you're on budget and on cloud nine. Let Financial become your everyday state of mind. Tap to start your journey to a more chill financial reality. These are Ed Words of Wisdom by Edward Jones.
Well, like everything, it's a little both, but the bad. So on the one hand, it gives them enormous strength, and it gives them this enormous connection, it gives them guidance. But the negatives, what's interesting, is it makes the Romans extremely traditional-minded and extremely conservative. And I mean conservative in the sense of resistant to change. So in the late Republic, which we'll probably talk about later, Rome desperately needed to change certain things. But it was a society that